Hello to everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. Just a few housekeeping. If hopefully you're all muted anyway, but if you're not, can you just make sure that you are muted so we don't have any distractions? We'll be using the question and answer session rather than the chat tonight. So any questions, if you can keep them specific to the subject of tonight's talk. If you've got any generic Dormouse questions, we'll be happy to answer them, but if you can just send them through via email or onto our contact list page on our website. And so without much further ado, I'll introduce you to Leo, who's going to hopefully talk to us for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer session afterwards. Michael's kindly going to collate all the answers just to make sure that none of them are duplicated. So yeah, please enjoy the show.
Right, thank you very much. I'll just start sharing my screen. That one. Has it come up? Excellent. Okay, thank you very much, Lorna. My name is Leo Gubert. I'm an ecologist. I've been working with dormice for quite a while now, and for about 10 years ago, when it was 2007, I found my first hibernating dormouse, and I was absolutely thrilled about it, because until then, most of my experience with dormice has been in the summer months, and it was always a mystery. You know, where do they go in the winter, and what do they do? And from that point onwards, I kind of started looking into the winter activity, or the no activity of the hazel dormouse. So what are the I think I will start again with from the beginning here, just give you a bit of an introduction on the species. The dormice, hazel dormice ticks, they have a really wide range, from East Russia to Western France, and they range from the Mediterranean to southern Sweden and England and Wales, together with a nice stretch here on northern Turkey. So they're protected throughout the range, and at the moment they're classified as vulnerable to extinction. So they're nocturnal. They spend most of the active time in the canopy, and they tend to come down to the ground to collect nesting material and to hibernate. So a lot of the information that we have, most of what we know about dormice actually comes from the summer, during the active season. So we know where they nest. They do nest in a wide range of different species using different materials, different heights. We got one here, which is gorse. And that one is actually quite interesting because it's really, really prickly, but they've managed to make a nice, comfortable home. This other nest is in broom. Bramble is obviously another favorite location. And they don't seem to be bothered with noise either, because that one, there's a nest there just right next to the a busy trunk road here in the southwest of England. So a lot of the stuff that we know, all the information that we collect, comes from the active season. So we do, a lot of you will be doing, or have experience with dormouse monitoring. So checking boxes, we go around checking the boxes, look what's inside. We occasionally find nests. Some are quite rather amazing, with loads of different materials. We tend to kind of collect the biometric, weight, sex, the other general information about dormice. But the real thing is what happens in the winter then, and what do we know about hibernation? Well, hibernation is certainly a really important strategy for many animals, because it's pretty much a way that they found to survive through the harsh conditions. So, you know, prepare for hibernation, what they tend to feed a lot in the autumn to boost the body weight and save enough fat to survive through the winter. So we have always kind of had this sort of weight between 12 and 15 grams as a rule of thumb. So that's the minimum weight a dormouse would need to enter hibernation and come out of it live. So in Britain, in Britain, hibernation now, it kind of tends to vary, but it's pretty much through October, between October and May. Some of them go into hibernation earlier and come out earlier. Some go quite late and come out early. So it's still pretty much weather dependent. So what's the point in hibernating anyway? One of the key things about hibernation is that the animals, they reduce the metabolic rate of their, they reduce key bodily functions, and they're able to reduce the metabolic rate by a great deal, which saves them a lot of energy. So a number of different species do that, and birds do that, amphibians, reptiles, insects, and plants. So it's a really good deal, a really good way to actually save the energy. And then one of the key things, he offers you a solution for animals that are not able to migrate. Because, I mean, we always heard of migration in mammals and birds, especially, where they just leave parts of our, the territory to warmer climates where they can endure the winter happily. So in mammals, we see three different types of dormancy: torpor, hibernation, and estivation. Torpor pretty much means it's a short period of torpor. They kind of shut down for a small period of time. Normally, it's about it's a bit ambiguous, but they say it's about less than 24 hours. Hibernation is torpor that lasts longer than 24 hours. And estivation is when animals do kind of fairly similar process, but in high temperatures. There is something like when we go to really warm places and we feel quite lazy and we slow down. And many people like to have a siesta at that time. So it's a torpor and hibernation. This is quite ambiguous, and this is a kind of a debatable when torpor becomes hibernation, and how long does the torpor has to be before it becomes hibernation. So at the moment, what we know is that dormice tend to hibernate on the ground, but I have radio tracking dormouse here. I found one entering this crevice in the tree, and it stayed there for 5 days. So whether that was hibernation or torpor is arguable. This individual here was found, that was February this year, in a nest box in a hazel tree, and he stayed there for about 7 days. It might have been there longer before I found it, but it was pretty much a long period of torpor. And the other thing that I found by radio tracking is that some of the animals, after they leave the nest boxes, they actually just stayed in trees before going to hibernation, and some actually stay there for months before going to the ground. So we stopped seeing them around October time, and some of them actually stayed up in trees until end of November. And the other funny thing was that some of them actually like to go into squirrel drays. So I found the 3 different dormice. They spent quite a bit of time on squirrel drays. So for me personally, I like to think that hibernation is when dormouse go to the ground and have a much longer period of torpor, which will become hibernation. I think in nest boxes, just really good to know actually hibernating or they're in torpor, because unless you monitor them 24 hours a day. So what do we know about dormouse hibernation at the moment? One of the things, the sad thing about dormouse hibernation is that a lot of them tend to die over the winter. And based on a study in Lithuania, we found that about a third of the population dies through the winter months. And a lot of them, they die because of starvation. And many of them actually associated, most of the deaths associated with juveniles. And on another study across 5 countries in Europe showed that dormice, they are particularly vulnerable in the spring, immediately after they awake from hibernation. And what I find is that sometimes when it's quite cold, we, I think it was last year, we had a kind of a really nice start to the spring. It was quite warm, and then temperature dropped within 2-3 weeks and went kind of sub-zero. And I think that almost forced animals to go back into hibernation again, because it comes to a point where it's not viable to stay up feeding if you're not going to balance out your energy budget. So the other thing that we know from studies is that dormice, they hibernate in the ground and are associated with a number of features. Include people have found them in a number of different locations, on the log piles, on the moss, leaf litter, shallows, crevices, holes, rabbit burrows, and a number of other things that you read in the literature at the moment. And then a radio tracking study in Switzerland followed 6 animals, and they found that most of them, well, half of them, they stayed at the same location. And then one particular individual changed locations 8 times. And then in the UK, well, in Britain, a similar pattern was found. So for me, studying hibernation nests, the first challenge, the problem starts finding hibernation nests because they are quite rare. And then many people that work with dormice, they have never seen a hibernation nest. And then I had been working with dormice for many years before I found my first one. Probably because of, I wasn't put the effort in to go and find them. But it's one way, the best way to find it for me is through systematic searches. And I've been doing this through my job, my role with as an ecologist, especially when we're doing well, winter habitat management for development purposes and for a number of other reasons, really. So we actually need to get on the ground to look for them. For the research, I have used radar tracking, and I tried a little bit of metal detecting. And Charlie Brown was the other option we looked at. And Charlie Brown is a Labrador, a highly trained search dog that has been trained to detect bats, hedgehogs. So he's quite an experienced dog. So Charlie Brown was a great addition and brought me a lot of hope because he was really, really good at finding nests that I hid. Because what I was doing, I had a collection of hibernation nests, and that was we used many of those to train him. And when I went out and I hid this hibernation nest within a 50-meter radius of Charlie Brown, he was very quickly to find them. But the problem came when he was tasked with finding wild nests. So some of the locations I knew where there were hibernation nests that I had been there for weeks, and that Charlie Brown really struggled to pick up the scent. And I think one of the reasons that is when a dormouse is hibernating, there is very little scent coming from the nest. And for another reason, I'll talk to you about later on in the presentation. And at the same time, once the leaves fall down the ground, they almost create a layer. There is very little scent coming from the ground, so they almost seal the surface of the soil. And I think that's quite a good strategy for dormouse, actually, because they want to be away from hidden away from predators. So radar tracking was quite a challenge. One of the challenges really is to fit a radio collar on the dormouse that has pretty much doubled in size in the last few weeks. And then you need to allow enough room for the dormouse to kind of loose. You can't put it too tight and you can't put it too loose. So it was a bit challenging. And for this study, we used a new design, which is instead of using the classic cable tie picture, we used a color that was, it's actually, this is a Teflon ribbon. It's really flexible. And the antenna actually goes in there. It's quite short, but it's fairly effective. And together with radar tracking it, I have also been using microchipping to allow identify individuals through the seasons and through the winters. So metal detectors, with metal detecting was another good attempt. And this is being tried in Lithuania, where they've got a little ring. They use like similar to bud rings on dormice. They're allowed to do it over there. And I was actually hoping to pick up the metal inside the microchips. But with the metal detector, it's really hard because there's very little metal to detect, and there's a lot of interference when you kind of get really close to the ground. So I tried, but had to give up on that. So that was a hope. Now, systematic searches are good, and to be fair, it's pretty much the only thing that we have and might be the least disturbance that we can offer to dormice when actually looking for them in their hibernation habitat. But the problem is, where do you start? If you go to a site like this and you read the Dormouse handbook, you find the logs, you find leaf litter, you find crevices and lots of different places they can be. So it's really, really difficult. And some of the other sites, this is another nest I found. It's just on the kind of corner. This is pretty much grasslands of tussocks or Molinia on the edge of a wet grassland patch. So when it comes to hibernation sites, they can be quite varied. There's loads of different sites that they have used. I mean, this is another one. This is just a layer of bracken. This is probably about February time. And this dormouse nest is just about there in the open away. The nearest it would be that little oak, some 3-4 meters away. And that's the tiny nest. Now, this is another site. This is pretty much a hazel coppice. But then if you to search for dormouse nest here, you probably would really struggle because it's quite hard to actually find and get, bash your way through the vegetation. But they are there nevertheless. And this is another one that's quite interesting, this one, because you can just about see a little flag there. There's a nest just on the foot of the hazel here. And it was probably one of the nicest nests I've seen. But once you come too close, you still can't quite see it. The nest is just there. It's this one. It was particularly interesting. It had a really, really kind of well-built core of grass and honeysuckle bark, and it had this kind of a coat of moss on top. And that dormouse, after a while, she moved. She was nicknamed Doris because that was the name of a storm that was around when I was radar tracking her. So Doris was on the other side of the river, and then she got fed up with her location, and she went to another kind of a really nice another kind of temporary site where she built a nest with leaves before moving to this cliff. That was about just under 100 meters from the first location. So it was quite interesting. So she was there for about 6 weeks before moving on. And one of the reasons they put this video on is to see how active she was when she left the nest. So it was quite cold. It was the date on the camera here is wrong, but it was March. Temperature is correct, but it's quite interesting that when she woke up, she had to warm up fully before moving on to another location, which was that. It's just the foot of the hands. She was there without a nest. And when I picked her up, she lost 10% of her body weight on that waking up and moving on to this side of the river again. So waking up from hibernation for dormice is quite expensive because they spent a kind of almost like 30 minutes just warming up and shivering. And so it takes a while to come out of that, and takes a lot of energy to come out of hibernation. So if you come out of hibernation too soon, it's dangerous because there's not much food for you. At the same time, the weather is still quite bad, or it's quite wet or quite cold. They'd be wasting a lot of energy just doing that. So you can see the fur of the dormouse here if you look closely. It's just there. Now, one of the things I've been looking really hard is to find things that hibernation sites have in common. Why did they actually choose the locations that they choose? Now, this one is a bit intriguing because it's south-facing. It's again in the open. It's an area where surrounded by bracken, and the nest, it was just there on the ground on kind of a little bit of a gradient. And what we find sometimes, the dormice they dig a hole, which is maybe in half. It just kind of is that sort of shape, so the nest sits there quite nicely, probably to prevent it from rolling. Now, conifer plantations, they seem to be quite resourceful when it comes to conifers. This one, it was sat right next to a pine tree. This one is under this one was just as one of those kind of Devon banks. It was just sitting there about a foot off the ground. And this one is right in the middle of the rows. So each one of these, the intriguing thing is that each one of these were built in different ways. So that one next to the foot of the tree had this layer of pine needles around it and a core of bracken. It's really interesting, the shape of this hibernation nest and the way the needles are arranged almost in a way that's kind of forms a roof over the nest. And what I find fascinating is how dormice, how much time do they actually spend building a nest like that, and how do they actually get the needles to stick together? So this one under the fern was kind of made up almost entirely by fern fronds. This one on the hedge had a little bit of other materials like beech leaves and bracken. And that one in the middle of the ride is almost made entirely by bracken. Now, this dormouse you see here, it was nicknamed Boris, but it's nothing to do with the Prime Minister. But he really made my life really complicated. The reason is he is the one that built his nest in completely different locations and built his nest with different materials. So if you're studying where the dormouse is hibernating, it's really tricky to actually see the logic why he chose different locations like that. And the reason why he chose different materials. And to be fair, I mean, how proficient he is in putting this kind of nest together using whatever resource he can. So one of the things I found with this hibernation nest is that the materials are harvested very locally. So most of them, it was within 0.5 meter. So they tend to collect the materials surrounding the nest, probably to make sure that the nest that they're going to spend a very long time in blends in with what's around them. So it doesn't stand out. They're not going away for 50 or 100 meters, bringing material from elsewhere, even if it's a better material, such as grasses and honeysuckle bark, which seems to be a preferred one for summer nests. So they actually use what they can, and the result is is fairly good, because I mean the dormouse was here. Even that one is not a lot of material, but it was kept dry through the winter. So this is another one in conifer plantations, another one right in the middle of the rows. So that one again was just collected using materials that was got immediately surrounding the nest. So that one is kind of hidden away. It's just really difficult to spot when you're walking past, but once you train your eyes, you kind of get the feel for it. It gets easier. This is the nest they found, conifer. This is under a large tree. And again, that was quite different. This one is using, there's a lot of moss around this nest. And again, they just to blend it in with the surroundings. So they almost kind of really, really well camouflaged. And again, this is really kind of, unless you're looking for it, it's really hard to spot. Now, on roadside verges, being a Highways England ecologist, I have a lot of experience with dormouse surveys and mitigation and work around roads. So one of my sites I was radio tracking was a road verge. And this one was quite interesting. When I was looking for dormouse, and then the signal was kind of taking me right on a busy road. So I thought it might have been a matter of maybe the dormouse lost its color, or I wasn't really sure what I was going to find until I got quite close to it. And there's the nest right there on the concrete of the wing wall. So this is a little bit of grass there, but it's sitting right nicely on top of the concrete, and really well insulated with grass. So again, earlier this year, I was doing another job, some habitat, woodland management in Hampshire. And then I spotted this summer nest. This was just before, this was about June, July, or summertime. And when I came in the winter, I always thought, well, they must be nearby. And sure enough, they were. Just about 30 meters, this bramble here is just sitting on top of that, pretty much on that top of that plastic bag. So dormice was here. They were nesting on the road verge, amidst the rubbish and all the other bits that you find on road verges. And this time I actually found two nests, one right next to that little stem, ash stem, and the other one just there. And these, they must be about 2 feet apart. And again, that was quite interesting. So hibernation nests, they are quite special because they have to be built to last at least a certain time. You know, they have to be well constructed to make sure that you survive. And I think this is one of the things that are quite critical for dormice to survive. So you need to know how to build a nest robust enough to make sure that you are protected when you're completely out. So this one, it was right next to a footpath just there under the fern. So this was just before Christmas when they took this. This pic was about 17th, 18th of December. And then over a month later, it was still pretty much there. I mean, it lost a little bit. It's not as glossy and shiny as it was, but it's still pretty much in place. Now, as the time goes through, I mean, this is in March now, you could actually see the dormouse in there because the nest was actually falling apart. And then in April, a few weeks after that, the dormouse left the nest and then it completely disappears. It lost its integrity completely. But it just shows how important it is to have a good nest. And this one, again, is quite interesting because they seem to be quite resourceful and they use a number of different materials. That one is entirely made of bluebell stems. And this one, again, incorporating a number of other materials. There's a lot of strip bark. They use strip bracken stems, ferns, honeysuckle, grass, anything that can build a core will be used. So if they can't find any grass around or honeysuckle, they will strip the bark of ferns and bracken, which proved to be quite popular. So the hibernation nest, they got quite a nice structure because a lot of them, they have this little, not all of them, but they have the core, the grass core, or the kind of a spherical core that we find in many of the summer nests. And then they actually use moss, which proved to be useful on sites where you can use it for camouflage. But the thing is about moss, it actually keeps the nest damp, because humidity is another thing that's quite important for dormice, because they have to, you have to make sure the site is humid enough so that you don't dehydrate during hibernation. Because we lose a lot of moisture by breathing alone. So there's the dormouse there, and this one had the radio collar in it. So some of these nests I had to replace the battery, so I had to do this. And in most cases, they stay there for a while before moving on. So hibernation nests, they come in many shapes and sizes, but generally they tend to be quite small, because they are not like a breeding nest or a maternity nest that you find a lot of material. These are quite tiny, because dormice, one of the reasons is they tend to hibernate alone. And all it is just to keep you dry. The point is they want to kind of lower the body temperature. Anyway, they want the temperature to be as stable as possible. And one of the things that I found on the ground measuring temperature is that the temperature tends to oscillate a lot less than at a canopy level or at the height of a nest box, for instance. So at ground level, even when the ground was covered in snow and temperature dropped below zero, the temperature on the ground was always kind of very much stable, and it stayed just around freezing point. And some of the nests, they're kind of really simple. There is not much to them. Sometimes they only use one material. This one is again is a strip bracken, and it's only kind of a tiny layer, just to keep the dormouse dry. And over time, you can see they start to wear out. And this nest here was I spotted it shortly after heavy snowfall. So I think maybe before that the nest will probably still full, but this one, I was actually walking past it. I was quite surprised to actually see the further dormouse so visible. And the other thing is I find quite interesting is the way that they close the nest. I've seen this in some of the summer nests as well, and the maternity nests, when the mom goes in and kind of closes the door from the inside. And maternity and some of the hibernation nests is exactly the same. They go in, they make themselves comfortable, and then they take a bunch of grass, bend it in half, and push it outwards to block the entrance. And again, the other thing that's quite interesting is these depressions that they build, because I mean, if you think dormice, they're not really designed to dig. And even though they're using when you look at the hands and paws, they're kind of pretty much designed to climb, but they can make this really, really spherical, kind of symmetrical depressions, which they kind of build their nest on. And the whole point, I think, is to prevent them from rolling or to become blown by the wind. So hibernation for professional ecologists and for woodland managers is always a challenge. We have a problem with hibernating dormice, because they are fairly vulnerable once they're on the ground. And since dormouse is a protected species, we do have to obey a number of rules. And we often need to apply for a license. I've just applied for one, which arrived today, to carry out pretty much what is woodland maintenance. And we are dealing with ash dieback a lot as well. So ash in some of the woodlands, they actually make up to half of the woodlands, half of the species, the tree species. So we need to start taking them out and replace them with other things. But that is actually becomes a licensed task. So there's a number of tips. I think it has improved a lot in the last 10 years, I say, because when my first my first license that I applied to carry out work in the winter, there was no mention in searching the ground or tips on how to carry out fingertip searches and things. But a lot of it has changed, and there's quite a lot of information now available on the website, on the .gov Natural England website. So a lot of these, because you don't have any other means to find the dormouse nest and to get on your knees and to search for them. So we have kind of a fairly straightforward protocol. We don't tend to search too far ahead of the work. We always have ecologists searching ahead of the gang that's doing the work, contractors or colleagues that will be felling the trees or be doing the coppicing, the pollarding, and so on. So what we do, we tend to, because dormouse, they are found to move nests quite regularly. So you don't want to search too far ahead. If you can do it the day before the works are going to be done on the same day, that's the best way of doing it. And if you're doing a large section and you know there are dormouse around, you're likely to find them. So when you do, the best thing to do is to take a photograph of where the nests are and the position of that you find the dormouse nest, so that when you come to move in it, you know exactly where to take it to. So there are a number of other things that you can look, the height, or is it under the tree? Just look for kind of features around the nest that you can replicate when you have to, if you have to relocate it. So the key thing is to kind of hold the nest for as little time as possible. Be tempted not to open it if you see that plug that I showed you earlier is in place. If there's a door in the nest, be tempted not to shake it. That's another very important tip. And ideally, you want to place it as close as possible to where you found it. In most cases, what I find is actually easy to leave it where it is. And what we do, we create a buffer and then brief everybody on site or anyone that might come across that location to stay out of it, so that they don't trample on the nest. So we just do, if you can keep it what it is, please do. If you don't, just relocate, find a safe place as close as possible to where you find it. And then let everybody know where you put it, so that everyone else is aware of the dormouse hibernation nest there. Now, searching for nests, this type of location is probably the worst nightmare. So if you have a fairly large area to search for hibernation nests, the best thing is to find a friend and enlist your mates to come along with you. And if they're really good friends, they are probably like to be your friends for the rest of the task. Though you might find that some may want to leave the site and abandon you altogether, which I don't blame them. Because when you look at hibernation nests in a really thick mat of ivy, they're likely to be right under the ivy, and you have to kind of search through that. And it's really time consuming, and you will lose your will to live very quickly. So one of the things that you can do to kind of make your life easier, if you know, especially if you're doing like single stages clearance, is actually prepare the ground ahead. So if you know you're going to do winter habitat management along that location, or if you have a dormouse mitigation license for planned works, there are a lot of things you can do. If you go back to this site here, what you can do, you can actually come here before hibernation, say end of September, early October, and actually cut your way through the ice, trim it with a trimmer, and you kind of create paths so that you can move along, or you can create clearings where you can store all your risings and logs or so on. So the other thing they found that's quite useful is using a blower. So by using a blower, I can actually clear a lot of the, especially where you have really deep leaf litter. It makes life a lot easier, even though there's a lot of leaves coming down through the autumn, but it's still quite straightforward to search. I mean, that will just kind of facilitate you finding a hibernation nest. But you just need to make sure that it's still warm when you do it. And then the ground after that is a lot easier to actually find, to look for hibernation nests. Or you can come in, as the leaves fall, you can come in and bring a blower again and just kind of have another bash. So woodland management is really important to keep, especially to maintain the growth of a good kind of dormouse habitat. But you need to kind of be aware that might be dormouse hibernating around you. So again, if you take the steps to kind of some precaution to make sure that you're not trampling or you're not storing material on top of a hibernation nest, this is kind of really important that you do search the ground. And if you're doing work with a bunch of volunteers, then you can actually use the force to actually help you. So with this so far, I mean, there's a lot of there's loads of information coming out of the studies from the radio tracking exercise, which for me was probably one of the most fantastic things I've done working with dormice, because it just opened a whole new dimension into dormouse behavior that I wasn't really aware of. Places that they absolutely fantastic. So they are extremely flexible when it comes to location, as you have seen. And if you remember my first slide and you look at the dormouse range, it's quite wide. So they have to deal with a number. It's the same species, and they have to deal with a number of different situations, different habitat, different species of trees, different food. So they are fairly flexible, and they are prepared to to take opportunity to make the best of whatever they're served with. So the other thing, they are likely to move to a new nest during hibernation, so they don't seem to stick around the same nest through the winter, which was something that I expected that most animals would do when they started this research. And the other thing, that nest materials, they can pretty much use anything, and they are whatever is around the location that they decide to build a nest. So the other thing that was concerned is that, do they have to leave their habitat and maybe migrate somewhere? Do they have to kind of cover a lot of ground to find a good hibernation nest? And the answer is that they actually stay very nearby to where they are. And most dormice will be probably less than a 50-meter radius to the place. So if you got nest boxes in a woodland, they will be within 50 meters. Chances are that they will be hibernating within 50 meters of that box. And then the other thing that I found is that hibernation nests still very difficult to find. But if you do have to look for them, I think the best way is still systematic searches. It's certainly cheaper than going through training and going through all the trouble of putting a license together to get to radio tracking license, and it's just really difficult. And it's also quite intrusive, because the radio tags, they probably affect the behavior in a way. Although a lot of them just went into hibernation straight away, but some they had developed, some of them I had to cut the collar because they develop a bit of abrasion in the neck, or they lost weight. So it's really important to kind of keep track of the collared animals. And before we actually started the radio tracking dormice, we tried the collars on captive animals and also a number of other species of small mammals, including bank voles, which was quite helpful just to see how, in practice, how to kind of fit the collar, etc. So thank you very much. That's what I had for you. I'll be quite happy to answer your questions. Or are we still there?
Just one moment.
Oh, I can hear you.
Yes, we're still here.
Excellent. I'm actually developing. I see a lot of us at this time of the to what we've been through now. We've been starting to develop these psychic powers, because a lot of us are just saying, "I can hear you, I can't see you. Well, I can't see you, but I can hear you." I think our next step will be, "I can't hear you or see you, but I know I can feel your presence."
A few questions have come through, Leo. Some of which you've answered during the talk, the ones that obviously were later answered, but one that you haven't touched on is there any evidence that, this is a question from Julie, is there any evidence that climate change is affecting dormice hibernation? And if so, what are the likely impacts?
Yeah, I think the what I've noticed, I will go back just before hibernation. What I have noticed with the last 5 seasons, especially, it might just be an impression from my side, but they seem to be having late litters a lot. So I think this is kind of having a kind of a knock-on effect. Some of the animals, they go into hibernation, the ones that we find, especially towards the end of October, they're weighing kind of way past 20 grams or late to 29 or 30 grams or past 30 grams. These are the first ones to go into hibernation. They go quite early. Now, the lighter animals, what I found is that they tend to stay on, because temperature now, it doesn't seem to be that cold. I mean, we had kind of towards the end of this November, we had kind of a cold spell. And I think some of them, they actually stay on feeding, and they actually go into hibernation. They can cope to go into hibernation quite late. And there was a juvenile that was born quite late this season. I found him early December. He was about 12 grams, and this is one of the collared individuals. And he stayed on, putting on weight, so he's still finding things to eat. But he was kind of it was a lot of a torpor in there. But he didn't go into hibernation until quite late. It was pretty much mid-January when he finally went into a nest in the ground. So I think inevitably it will have an effect. If the weather keeps warming up, there's no reason to hibernate, because there is certainly food for them. They'll probably be feeding on insects and other things. And I know there's parts of when you imagine the Mediterranean part of their range, they don't hibernate there because it's warm enough, so that they don't have the trade-off is not as bad as living in a temperate climate. So here they go into hibernation to save energy, but if there is enough food for them to cope with that, they'll probably stay active, feeding.
Thank you. Rachel asks, have you found them in nest boxes or tubes hibernating?
I found that one in a nest box, but that is the query. What is hibernation? How do we define hibernation? Is it a torpor that lasts 24 hours? If hibernation is a torpor that lasts more than 24 hours, the answer is yes.
Yes.
And they will use nest boxes. They will use trees and other features in the canopy as well to hibernate.
Question from Heather. What would you say are the main benefits of radio tracking over systematic searches, and do those benefits outweigh the potential negative effects that wearing the radio collars have on the individual dormice?
I think radio tracking is quite laborious. It depends. Radio tracking for me, it was for the research was quite important, I think, because I wouldn't be able to be telling you I have to probably cut my slice by half, because I've learned so much about what they do, especially the period pre-hibernation. And the fact that when they left the nest boxes, they're actually not going to hibernation straight away, but they were going into squirrel drays, or they were going up in the trees, and they're still active in the canopy, but they weren't use nest boxes. I don't know exactly why that is, but it was quite interesting. Now, systematic searches, if you need for kind of development purposes and for woodland management, it's probably the best way to find them, because anybody can do it, and you know, anyone with a license, as long as you don't kind of disturb them, or you can safeguard them, especially if you're doing hibernation, woodland management with volunteers, then you don't want to spoil your goodwill by squashing dormice on the ground. So it's really important that you search for them.
On the woodland management side of things, question from Jason and from me as well.
Yeah.
Of the same question is, do you believe that woodland management needs to be done under a license? So that seems quite a big ask for a lot of woodland managers.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I am kind of half-hearted. I think that we tend to, here in Britain, we tend to overmanage things. And I think if you leave a site alone for long enough, you don't have to do any management. So the problem with the management, once you start, you have to kind of keep doing it a lot, or you can just do in a cyclic way, but maybe having kind of larger intervals. But I think if you leave a site, and I think I've got near me here, we have a site that hasn't been managed for 30 years, and it's quite ugly to begin with. But in the last 10 years, I think, as you can see, the canopy start to take shape. Once you do the first hit, so you thin out the woodland or the main tree species, everything else will kind of fall into place. We start getting the understory developing, but it's important that you don't overdo it, I think, by too much thinning or coppicing, especially. And I think coppicing hazel is one of the things that we tend to focus on. But hazel, if you don't coppice, they're able to regenerate quite happily. They will just stay there, and you don't need to coppice hazel to keep it alive, if that makes sense.
I suppose it's what else you're managing for, isn't it?
Yeah.
Start losing your woodland flora if you don't coppice, if it's a traditionally coppiced woodland. So there's lots of interesting.
Yeah, the other thing is some say that, if you stop managing, obviously the number of dormice will reduce. But then I think it's really important that you have areas where you don't touch, you don't interfere, because then you always have that kind of a refuge for dormice over winter. At the same time, the other thing that I learned by radio tracking is how important mature trees are. So these big trees are really, they actually were paramount importance before they went to hibernation, because they all left the nest boxes and they're quite high up, and the trees they always chose mature trees. So it's important that you have them on site.
While we're on trees, this is from Hamish. I was interested to know why it's necessary to fell trees with ash dieback rather than just leave and assess. Also,
I think we
in hibernation situations, do you have any evidence that they survive?
The ash dieback, the problem with the ash dieback is, I mentioned earlier, is within the road corridor, and a lot of these trees, they're within striking distance. So it's more a matter of health and safety. So we have no option than to take them. The ones that are far out, we actually just leaving them to come down, by themselves, really, because there is no need to interfere. And the problem sometimes I find with this woodland management is sometimes you want just to take out one tree or a group of dead trees, but it's the disturbance that you cause to get to that group of trees and the impact it has on as you fell the trees onto the woodland floor and surrounding vegetation. There's a fairly high impact, and the amount of time and the amount of effort you need to be around those to either windrow or kind of process the risings. So it takes a little bit of time, and then and a lot of disturbance as well.
There's a few more questions that appear now. Someone wants to know if you could expand a little on hibernation in terms of, just wondering if you could expand a little on what they would eat through the winter if the temperature is high enough for them to stay on. You mentioned insects. Would this be overwintering larvae, that kind of thing? Is there anything else that they would eat? So this is probably the climate question, isn't it? Where we...
Yeah, I think it's funny because I think the climate change will benefit or otherwise a number of other species. So trees are able to kind of flower and seed until late. So that will be the plants will be following that pattern. Because I mean, especially with ash was a tree that it kind of held on to the leaves until really late in the season. So until it got really cold, then it dropped the leaves. I think a number of other species of plants and other key plants there in the key items there within the dormouse diet will be following the trends, and I'm hoping they'll probably fruit until later. But the dormice over the winter, the juveniles, I'm pretty sure that he was feeding on insects and larvae. But I'm sure that they will find things to eat. I think it's something that we'll have to kind of study. There's a lot more to know about dormouse diet before hibernation season or during the hibernation season.
Well, this will be an easy answer. Can you look for hibernation nests without a license?
Yeah, well, yes. The fact is the same as when you look for hibernation, like summer nests. You can spot it, but you're not allowed to interfere with it. So you can see if you can't search for it, if you do find it, the best thing to do is just kind of mark out the area and make sure it's safe.
I suppose it's when does searching become interfering? Because if some of the searching can be quite invasive, can't it?
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to kind of pick it up and have a look at it, because it's quite tricky to find. Some of them are fairly obvious, but some of them actually sit right within kind of the kind of leaf layer, especially. You wouldn't know unless you kind of touch it and pick it up.
What are the key steps habitat managers need to take to protect the dormice? So I suppose we've covered that, isn't it, the searches and... Yeah,
I think for large scale forestry, kind of one of the things that you can do, I think, is prepare the roots. The whole roots are quite important, so that you can actually prepare the ground by maybe using some of the examples I mentioned, maybe by streaming or by blowing some of the leaves before you get to work on the site. The other thing is just to plan it exactly where and how you're going to extract the timber, if that's the case, or if you're just doing thinning, where you're going to keep it, so that you can kind of plan ahead. Because I think there was a study done by Roger Trout, and he used those kind of Christmas trees bowls and kind of hid it on the ground randomly. And then he came in with the machines and they carried out all the thinning and the harvesting they were supposed to do. And then afterwards, he went back to the locations and found that a lot of them were actually broken. So they were destroyed by the operations. So if those were hibernation nests, they probably would have been squashed or affected by the works.
What are the next steps of your research study? This is Tanya from Warwickshire Dormouse Group.
Yeah. I think I collected a lot of data to try to facilitate people to identify hibernation nests within their own woods. It's really hard because I mean, one of the things, just looking at data alone, like if you're there to, if you look at that Dormouse Boris, the one that built the 4 different nests at 4 different locations, it's really difficult to kind of collect enough information together with all the other nests that I have collected to come up with variables that actually stand out. So we have been working on a bespoke model using LiDAR, satellite and aircraft imagery to help out with really detailed microclimate models. So what I'm hoping to do is to come out, I'm pretty much in the middle of it. So I think the next time you hear from me, I'll be talking about the results of that. So how we can use remote sensing and microclimate models to help us look at hibernation nests. So that is the ultimate goal for me. So hopefully I'll get there. And the other thing I'm looking out is how they prepare in terms of weight gain and loss in the period just before hibernation and survival rates. And then the other thing I have looked at quite detailed was the hibernation nest materials, which is there's a paper coming up very shortly. So that will be probably the next publication, I think, that's coming out of this.
There's 2 more questions. There's one that's quite a long question from David, which I'm going to copy and email that one because there's quite a lot in that one. So I'll make sure yourself and Lorna get sight of that one and get back to the questioner yourself. This last one from Heather. Also, if you find a hibernation nest in winter where the dormice are visible, do you cover them up with anything or do you just leave them exactly as found?
I just leave them. I leave them because I think what happens, you remember that I found the dormice, they move their nest, and I think they do that is actually just to kind of build the nest. So maybe when the sun or maybe the temperature changes slightly and that kind of trigger arousal, but I tend not to interfere with hibernation dormice. It's really hard because I mean sometimes you think that they might be vulnerable to a passing fox, or birds are quite good at kind of checking out the ground looking for food. But I would tend to I would recommend just leaving it alone.
Excellent. Over to you, Lorna.
Okay, that was really interesting, Leo. Just add that we had a hibernation nest last winter that we found in Treswell Wood, and we had a camera on it, and we had so many different species around the nest. We had rats, fox, I think we had a badger, some deer,
woodcock,
pheasants, woodcock, and they didn't sniff out this nest even though it was right below their feet. So it is interesting that there's obviously no scent whatsoever that's being given off by this dormouse.
Yeah, I think this is the frustration with the search dog, but I think this really worked for the dormouse advantage. And the other thing is, because they kind of tend to nest at different locations, they're not always nesting next to the trunk of a tree or in a tree hole. Because maybe if a fox learns that dormice nest next to trees, they would always go to that location to look for them. It's nice that they have this the ability to actually build a nest with anything, anywhere. So that's is something that is quite remarkable.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Nottinghamshire Wildlife Trust for allowing us to hijack their Zoom account, and also Keeping It Wild, which is a youth ranger team. They did allow us to use their account, but we had so many participants that we had to bump it up to the Wildlife Trust. So huge thank you to both organisations, and really huge thank you to everyone for joining in and taking part today. If you want any more information about the Nottinghamshire Dormouse Group, if you just look on our website, which is www.notdormousegroup.uk, there's plenty of information out there. And obviously, if you want to take part in any of our monitoring, this year, unfortunately, we had to cancel all of our volunteer days out. But hopefully next year, now that the vaccination's moving forward, hopefully we'll be back to nearly normal. So if you want to come along on a box check, please do get in touch. So I'd just like to say thank you to Leo. Obviously, thank you to Michael for being the technical director for tonight. And yeah, take care, everyone. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.